Yesterzine, the show where we play the best and worst of a month's video games and decide if we can still tell which is which. It's SNES week on Yesterzine, and our magazine issue of choice is Superplay, issue 25 from November 1994. Again, we're dealing with the first issue of a magazine I bought after I got the system. I was a smart kid, so I'd gone for Mario Kart and Super Mario All-Stars when I bought it, but standing there in the local indie newsagent, it was the review of a supposed Mario Kart killer that caught the eye. Certainly more so than Secret of Mana, which I'd not heard of as a kid not really into RPGs. Strange though that is for someone who constantly played point-and-click adventures. And, spoiler alert, the aforementioned Mario Kart Killer Street Racer is the top scorer in the issue, if only because Mana had already been reviewed in import form in a previous issue nearly a year earlier. But the rules say best reviewed new game, and so we're going to have to play Street Racer and see if it being a Mario Kart killer was hype or reality. First though, I think we're going to need to refresh our memories. And I'm in an awkward position from the off here, because I've been telling anyone who'll listen that, with the possible exception of the most recent game, Mario Kart 8, Mario Kart 1 is still the best one in the series. I haven't though put serious playtime into it for quite a while, so we could be beginning this episode with a healthy serving of humble pie. Booting Mario Kart though immediately calms those nerves. There's just something about Nintendo intros, and Mario Kart might be the king of it. It could be the music, it could be the little 2D race going on at the bottom of the screen, or it could just be them showing off the SNES's scrolling ability by running the whole thing along a backdrop. But it's near scientifically impossible to be anything other than happy starting up Mario Kart. It's also gorgeous even now. It's bright, clear, and fast. Partially helped by using a half-screen play area in single player with a large map at the bottom that's actually very helpful. It looks simple these days, but it does not look bad, and unlike so many other games at the time, the graphics never get in the way, especially when it's as smooth as a well-lubricated butter slide. Mario Kart 1 is a simpler game than its later cousins, but that's something that's always appealed. I tend to think for arcade games, the later Mario Karts have got somewhat flabby. Laps are longer than I'd like, which is why there's so few of them in the race. And the courses are so full of shortcuts and secrets that for the casual player you'll lose simply through not having the experience, which always seems like a bad idea for a party game. I played through the first championship in this game in under 15 minutes. You can get a game in virtually regardless of how much time you've got to spare. And the driving in Mario Kart is still a joy. On the grippier circuits, such as the classic Mario circuit, you can either run some serious racing lines with Koopa, or slide around like a complete buffoon with Donkey Kong. The latter will easily get you the best times, but the worse acceleration of the large characters makes it a risk, and in the lower speed classes, probably not one to take. There's a couple of other quirks in this first entry into the series too. Item blocks do not regenerate, which I quite like because it forces you to come offline and search for them. Not so much though, because unlike in the later games, the other characters don't use the same blocks as you, but each just have a single item of their own they seem to be able to spam constantly. That's a little frustrating depending on who is around, because the effect of those blocks is wildly different based on who the game has decided is your direct competition in any given championship. Mario and Luigi, for instance, can turn invincible, making themselves virtually impossible to pass on a tight track, but if you do get ahead, and if you win you start first for the next race, then they can't touch you. Yoshi though can throw explosive eggs directly into your path, and possibly even worse, Toad's mushrooms can shrink you, which slows you down and leaves you vulnerable to being squashed, which is a double punishment. The further unique feature is one I'm glad they abandoned, if I'm honest. You don't actually have your full top speed in a race until you get to 10 coins off the track. You also lose a coin in any collision, and any spin out, however so caused, loses you 4. So you can end up being punished in 3 ways just by being hit from behind. To be fair, it's not like the later games were immune to punishing you multiple times for one mistake, and at least the dreaded blue shell had yet to be invented. Mario Kart is exhibiting some old school game design here. Most notably that your competitors do not quite play by the same rules that you do. If a CPU player is preordained to be your biggest competitor, even if you take them out they will all but teleport to the front again, which means there's basically no point unless you're right near the end of a race. So it's not without its frustrations by any means. The basic driving and racing experience though, it's lost nothing. But that's not really the question we were here to answer. We want to know if, aged 25 years, Street Racer is still its equal, as Superplay eventually concluded. I did have Street Racer back in the day, but it was the very different Mega Drive version. Lacking the SNES's famous Mode 7 tricks, which is what enables these large, flat, 3D-like playfields and fast rotation, best showed off on launch by F-Zero, it worked much more like the early faux 3D games like Super Hang-On, essentially forcing you down a tunnel. So I'm coming to the SNES version pretty fresh, having just played Mario Kart, as you'll remember from 30 seconds ago in this video. On startup, it's immediately clear that Street Racer has a somewhat different look to Mario Kart. It's less cartoony, more dirty, more, I'm sure they would have liked me to say, grown up. In reality, that probably just means dark. I don't know if it's the graphical style, but to me it looks lower resolution than SNK as well. Where this matters is, it's quite difficult to see the tracks, especially as, thanks to the full screen graphics, there's only a tiny map. So a lot of Street Racer is reactive in a way that Mario Kart isn't. This doesn't feel like a game where, even back then, you could lose an afternoon in trying to get a few hundredths quicker in a time trial, as I did multiple times on Super Mario Kart. Street Racer though isn't without its life-extending tricks. It's configurable in a way that console games rarely are. You can turn on and off weapons, fighting, damage, and even collisions. Most impressively, you can do all of these individually for each player, which would be a very nice way of evening up a game between two players of different skills. There's also a very welcome difficulty setting, although really Mario has that with its engine size system. And credit should be given for the custom cups, allowing you to construct a championship with only your favourite slightly smudgy flat tracks in. I should explain that actually, because it took me a while to twig. Listen closely because this is the science bit. Look at these two clips from both games. Notice the difference. Well, Mario Kart has objects with height, Street Racer does not, other than the karts themselves. And apparently this is a technical difference. Mario Kart has an additional processor in its cartridge, the SNES Digital Signal Processor, or DSP, and it's that allows this trickery. Of course, it also costs more, and it's money Vivid Image and Ubisoft decided not to spend. I think though that contributes much to the lack of personality in Street Racer's courses. The other difference is weapons, in that Street Racer doesn't really have them. There are no shells or mushrooms to be picked up from the track in this game. Each character, however, can punch left and right to do damage, and also has their own single special move. It's not quite the same though, and for a game that seems to have a heavier bias towards fighting, it's a bit of a shame it's that anemic. There's a couple of extra modes. We saw the Proto-Geometry Wars last issue, hiding on the one cover disc, and here we have what is unmistakably 1994 Rocket League. Although here it's all the karts for themselves and a single goal. It's a laugh for a bit, but it's far too claustrophobic for this control system. Rumble mode is the Mario Kart battle mode offering, but without the weapons it's just a lot of running into each other, and almost all the time I ended up trapped against the edge. So no, unlike Superplay's claims, Street Racer, especially with hindsight, is not the equal of Mario Kart, but I think you have to cut them some slack here. When Street Racer was reviewed, Mario Kart was already 2 years old with no sequel in sight, so really if you'd rinsed SMK this might seem like the answer to your prayers. And it's really not bad, despite the tone of this piece coming across as something of a kicking. It tries to be different with its personality, it allows 4 players on one screen, it's got some depth. It's just that this is 2019 and you're only going to want to play one kart game on your SNES, and with the best will in the world, it's never going to be this one. Before we get to this issue's gaming hell, if you're Generation Z, you might need an explanation for why the game on the cover isn't reviewed or even previewed in the issue. In fact, as we mentioned earlier, Secret of Mana was the best part of a year old by the time Superplay stuck it on the front of issue 25. And the reason for that is imports. In 2019, we get edgy if a game comes out in the UK 3 days after our fine friends across the pond get it. In 1994, that would be near unimaginable. With delays for translation, for conversion to our better but slower TV system, and just for weird licensing reasons, games would often be this delayed. Secret of Mana is by Square, more famous for the Final Fantasy series, but the first one of those that even got to the UK was the 7th. And even then it was a full 10 months behind the Japanese release, and 2 behind the US. Final Fantasy III didn't find a UK release until a Nintendo DS port in 2007, 17 actual years after it was produced. This meant that there was a big scene in importing games, and Superplay had always taken advantage of its status as an unofficial magazine to be a big part of that, reviewing Mana on its US release towards the end of 1993. And it probably had a big hand in its sales, as the game barely received any marketing spend outside its home country. It's really thanks to the forward-thinking coverage of magazines like Superplay that we now expect as a matter of routine to get worldwide releases of even niche interest titles. All of which goes to explain why a proper UK market optimised release of Mana was a big deal. And with no huge AAA releases this month, it's easy to understand why Superplay went big with a cover and 4-page feature on the game, also talking up a sequel which sadly remains a Japanese only release. Kids today just don't understand that pain, with their anime and their worldwide online gaming and their SNES classics, which incidentally does have Secret of Mana included in all regions. And Mario Kart, now we mention it. For some strange reason though, being the lowest scoring game in an issue of Superplay didn't qualify this next game for that honour. It's time to enter this issue's gaming hell.
Superman.
Then there's no time to waste.
Superman does not have a good history with video games. The problem you have is that Superman really is a superhero, and games need to involve some jeopardy. If you can stop bullets, leap over almost everything, fly over everything else, and do credible impressions of both birds and planes, then who can touch you? That's hardly the only issue though, and there's a reason Superman 64, which is what you're currently watching in the background, isn't just considered one of the worst Superman games of all time. It's one of the worst things humanity has been responsible for. It's so bad that it's considered a cliche to put it at the top when you get a bit lazy with your video games channel and do a top 10 crappy games list. So it's with some trepidation I play Death and Return for the first time in 2019, especially given the tremendous kicking Tony Mott gave it for Superplay in this issue. It scored a barely visible to the human eye 29%, and Tony had the following to say.
Mr. Dustman, you forgot this when you collected from us this morning. Take it away, it makes me very unhappy.
Those are words so non-minced, you can probably find them being served in a fine steak establishment. This is not one of those issues where what we get to play is the least good game. So, this game is going to beat expectations if booting to the title screen doesn't spontaneously give you explosive bum squirts. Hold up. Blizzard? That Blizzard? Yes it is. If you somehow stumbled across this despite knowing the names of about 5 games, you would probably still be with me if I said World of Warcraft. That Blizzard. In fact, when Death of Superman was released on the SNES in late summer 1994, the first in the series that would become World of Warcraft was only 3 months away. Plus, under their previous name of Silicon and Synapse, they wrote 2 of the finest games that would ever grace the SNES. In Rock and Roll Racing,
Viper fades into lap. Nick is dominating the race.
and the Lost Vikings. Both of which I'll happily spoil a future issue for you right now by telling you have not aged a day. More recently, you might know them for Diablo, or for StarCraft, or if you're one of the cool kids, but not quite cool enough for Fortnite, you might well have played Overwatch. A lot. All of which is to say that Blizzard, historically, do not make bad games. This has suddenly become an interesting story. We just don't know what kind of story. Is this the tale of how, for about 6 months in 1994, Blizzard forgot how to write games? Is it the tale of a reviewer being paid by Marvel to viciously slander a DC licensed game? Is it proof that all the good people were on Warcraft during 1994? Or is it a worthy game that for some reason doesn't quite work? Well, the first thing we're going to need to get over is that, as predicted, this isn't a Superman game. Because yes, we're playing fast and loose with Superman's abilities. The most obvious example of this is you don't get more than about 5 minutes into the game before this enemy appears, with a machine gun, and it turns out Superman is neither faster nor tougher than a speeding bullet. He's not more powerful than a locomotive either, unless a locomotive is considerably less powerful than this motorbike, which starts appearing in level 2. And as for leap tall buildings in a single bound, well, let's have a try. Well, unless they exclusively meant sandcastles and dolls' houses, that's probably a miss. So we'll judge this game, a Final Fight style beat 'em up, on its own merits. And it's got the basic ingredients. A bunch of enemies, a hell of a lot of which look suspiciously identical, come at you. And you send them back again via punching them repeatedly in the face. Then repeat. Then some plot might happen. Then repeat a bit more. It's a bit repetitive as a genre, but in that respect, Death and Return isn't any worse than the others I've played. It's introduced a good number of distinct enemies by the end of the first level, and a couple more immediately you enter level 2. And you have a little more at your disposal than punching. You can throw enemies, and some of the scenery. Throwing enemies at each other is always satisfying and buys you some time, although I didn't find I could do this as reliably as I'd have liked. And, in a concession to the fact this is supposed to be a superhero game, you also have Superman's eye lasers, although given they do marginally less damage than an office laser pointer, they're best avoided. You do also have one more weapon from the real Superman's arsenal. You can fly, which is a handy way to avoid enemies and wait for your chance to make a move, although the restricted visibility at the bottom of the screen when you use it kind of ruins its usefulness. It also raises the question, if Superman can fly, can he just fly to the end of the level and save me the bother of reducing the faces of a few hundred henchmen to bolognese? Yes, I know we weren't going to point out Superman failings here, but the game started it. So early on, the game doesn't quite know what it wants to be, but it's a very decent little entry in the genre, trying to do something at least a little different to the tide of side-scrollers you could get around this time. At the end of level 2, Superman dies. Not the kind of 9 lives left dying I've been doing constantly, but actual proper comic book death. Immediately, 4 others claim to be Superman, and from then on you get to play as them. This leads to more variety, as level 3 starts with this rather charming shoot-'em-up segment that is smart enough not to outstay its welcome, but is another example of this game having a few more ideas up its sleeve than your average brawler. At this point, you also start having to fight enemies who can fly, making for some fun, almost dogfight-like sections. By now, I'm terrible enough at these games to have to make use of the cheat to restore energy, but the inescapable conclusion is, I'm having fun. Which is honestly more than can be said for at least half the Super Nintendo games I've tried since the machine became obsolete. And while I'll have to continue to refill my energy a lot to do it, I'm going to go through the rest of this. It's a genuinely interesting game whose failings are, for the most part, shared with the majority of its genre circa the early 90s. Death and Return simply doesn't deserve the treatment Superplay gave it. Yes, I didn't have to pay £55 for it, but this is in no way bad enough to be the worst game in an issue. A quarter of a century and about $10 billion in World of Warcraft sales later, I'm enjoying my time with it. It's not a 29% game by any stretch. Not then, not now. Luckily, we have another candidate. Super Godzilla has the second worst review score of the issue, a full 10% higher than Superman at a dizzying 39%. But before I looked at scores, this looked like a much, much worse game. Godzilla stuff never works in the UK. As the review points out, Godzilla was only created as a legally distinct rip-off of King Kong. And why wouldn't you just watch a good Kong movie? Especially as everything we ever get on Godzilla is low-budget trash. At this point, I wish to apologise to the creative crew of the 2014 American-made Godzilla movie. That film, of course, is high-budget trash. Although, it was somehow successful enough that they'll be crossing the streams with the Godzilla vs Kong movie next year. The winner of which will presumably go through to play the winner of Alien vs Predator in the final. And, if you've been watching while I made a brave attempt at satire based on movies that are 5 and 15 years old, you'll have noticed that this game is the very definition of no localization effort beyond machine translation. So this is definitely going to be an authentic experience. The plot, and plot is a strong word, revolves around taking control of Godzilla so you can guide him into town and fight some other monsters that are apparently even worse, such as King Ghidorah, Biollante, and your mum. So the game is broadly divided into two parts. In part 1, you trudge across town trying to find out where the villain of the week is hiding, while not losing too much energy to accidentally walking through buildings, and for some reason still being shot by the military, who have apparently not got the memo that you're the good dinosaur. The idea here is to collect items that'll help you later, which add health, stamina, or invincibility, all of which you'll need with the boss. The other half of the game is where you fight them in what appears to be the local market. And it's here things get confusing and weird. The game makes mention of trying to force down their fighting spirit gauge so you can attack, which in practice means move forward and hope he doesn't splat you. If you get a punch in with your stupid T-Rex arms, then you retreat and fire off a better attack. It's confusing and unfair, since half the time he splats you from right across the screen anyway, and Godzilla moves like he's every inch is 65 years old, and's got dodgy knees. Add to that the responsiveness only improving marginally from the 2D sections, and you pray for a Godzilla attack just so you can stop playing the bloody thing. Even if this all worked properly, with only 7 stages, this game is still thinner than a 5p carrier bag, and the reliance on items to get anywhere means yet more time trudging around the god-awful 2D map sections, which surely no one can enjoy. The items and the location of the boss are very slightly random, but that's the limit of the variety, so it's not like it'll get less tedious the 40th time. So yeah, Death and Return certainly didn't deserve that treatment. This is so much worse. Death and Return is a functional and interesting side-scrolling beat-em-up with some good ideas. This is just a confusing mess where even if the actual fighting had been better, there simply wouldn't have been enough of it. I agree with Superplay, these two games together probably did deserve 68%. Trouble is, at least 60% of that should have gone to Superman. The only building Super Godzilla is knocking down is the one where all the good games are kept. And with that we get to the back page advert, which this week is for the very interesting looking Amiga Power the Album, whose Kickstarter is probably launched by the time you watch this. Containing remixes by period artists of top period gaming tracks and endorsed by several of the fine folk behind the even finer magazine, it's going to be worth a look. Your best bet for finding out more would be on Twitter at Amiga_Square or at facebook.com/albumwithattitude. Turning to the inside back page, subscriptions are available free at the touch of a button and come with the free gift of any extra videos we make diving further into our games. Back issues are available from our playlist and you can contact us at yesterzineshow@gmail.com. More information in general can also be found at yesterzine.co.uk, and we'll be back very soon with the next issue. Until then, you'll find us camped out in front of the letterbox waiting for it. Cheery bye.